Radiation alert. A nuclear scientist tells us the cleanup at Japan's Fukushima plant could take 100 years. 6 years on from the disaster, we'll ask what happened to dreams of an atomic age. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency has called on the world to help in the clear-up of Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. When a huge earthquake and tsunami hit the site in 2011, it created the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, sparking meltdowns in 3 reactors. 6 years on, and the decommissioning process has barely begun. A British nuclear scientist who's just come back from Fukushima has told this programme it could take up to 100 years. Insight senior correspondent Dana Lewis reports.
In 3 years, Tokyo will host the Summer Olympics. And ironically, one of the commercial slogans asks, "Is Japan cool?" It would almost be funny if the situation wasn't so serious. 150 miles from Tokyo is the Fukushima nuclear power station, where the situation is not cool. It's a superheated atomic catastrophe ever since a powerful earthquake rattled Japan in 2011. A 15-meter tsunami engulfed Fukushima and caused 3 reactors to melt down. And they still are.
It's unknown where those cores are at. It's hoped, and Tokyo Electric is very optimistic about this, that it's still contained within the containment structures, even though it's burrowed into the containment structures in the foundations. But there is some possibility that it's burrowed completely through the containment, is sitting in groundwater.
It's hard to get a clear picture of what's happened inside the building because an army of robots has been killed trying to probe the damage, killed by radiation that melts their electronics. But we know this. One camera lasted long enough to show molten fuel debris had burned through the bottom of the inner reactor vessel. And incredibly, radiation levels are now the highest they've been since the triple core meltdown 6 years ago. None of that is good.
Deep inside Fukushima, there is a molten mess, which is essentially a radioactive soup of fuel rods and melted reactor cores. But exactly how deep are those cores? And that is a burning question. These close-up photographs show that it has burned through some of the containment structure and burrowed deep in the foundation of the reactor.
Until those cores can be retrieved, the radiation will keep spewing into groundwater and leaking. No one knows for sure where.
Some of that groundwater flows into the Pacific Ocean, radioactively contaminated.
And as far away as the American Pacific coast, there have been radiation levels found in fish. And radiation plumes have been tracked from Japan that have been detected on the shores of Oregon and in tuna caught nearby. Neil Hyatt is a professor of nuclear materials chemistry. He and a group of British scientists have come back from touring Fukushima. Well, at least the storage areas, where radiation levels are high but not lethal. And he admits the situation will haunt Japan for generations.
Somewhere between 40 and 100 years for the Fukushima cleanup and complete decommissioning is probably a reasonable estimate. So right now, the work is proceeding to target and to plan. They have an ambitious goal to retrieve some of the core material by 2020. And they have a lot of different approaches to doing that.
But while they plan to get to those cores, Tokyo Electric is struggling with a lethal radioactive dragon which emits radiation levels which can kill a person in less than a minute. They manage the situation by pumping water non-stop through the 3 reactors to cool melted fuel too hot and too radioactive to move. 400 tons of water each day passes through the reactors and then decontamination filters, and then into storage tanks, which are stacking up and up. 1,000 tanks now hold 920,000 tons of contaminated water. More tanks are being added, and they are running out of room to store them all.
One concern is that there could be a resumption of the nuclear chain reaction, and there are systems in place that would allow us to to detect that and take appropriate measures.
And what if the unthinkable happens? Another earthquake. Japan is susceptible to major earthquakes.
Another tsunami hits that site. The entirety of that wastewater, which is something like 1 million tons, could go into the ocean. This is an unprecedented catastrophe for the Pacific Ocean.
And there are 3.5 billion gallons of contaminated soil sitting in thousands of plastic garbage bags, stacked up in neat rows in the fields and abandoned towns surrounding the site. Japan's former Prime Minister has accused current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of lying about the situation being under control. And Abe is widely criticized for encouraging 6,000 residents around Fukushima to return to their homes, and many won't go back.
Even if we come back here, we won't be able to work in the fields. We won't be able to grow rice. We won't be able to pick the wild vegetables either. It will be the same for seafood and river fish. There are no positives.
Every time it rains, every time the wind blows, every time leaves fall off trees, that severe radioactive contamination is washing down from the mountains into the rivers, into the ocean. This is a part of the landscape now, and these places should not be lived in, and yet Abe is trying to force people back into these contaminated zones.
The Japanese government says Fukushima will be safe by 2020. It will hold the Olympic baseball and softball in the Fukushima area to show Japan is cool, even if its melted reactors are still dangerously hot. I'm Dana Lewis, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that, I'm joined in the studio by Mark Whitby. He's Chairman and Design Director at the engineering consultancy firm WME, and also by Dr. David Lowry, an independent research policy consultant specialising in nuclear issues. Gentlemen, let's consider Fukushima. Mark, this call came out for the world to help. Is it simply a matter, if you throw money at the problem, they can make more progress?
I think the world does need help, and the world is helping, and it helped from the moment, fortunately, the accident happened. This was an unprecedented accident. It was very close to being much worse than Chernobyl, and it was only saved through the collective efforts of the whole community. It wasn't so much the reactor cores which were melting. There was nothing they could do to retrieve that situation. The real problem was that one of the reactors had been recently taken offline. It had a fuel pond which was very hot, stacked with 20 years' worth of fuel rods, and that was beginning to boil dry. And to begin with, they flew helicopter loads of water dropping it in. Then they brought in specialist fire trucks to spray water onto the fuel tanks. Eventually, they flew in with big Russian transport plane, huge concrete pumps, which were able to penetrate through the wall of the reactor, because the reactors had exploded by this time, get through the wall and drop water directly onto it, which kept the fuel pond from boiling. Now, had that fuel pond boiled, and President Khan was very aware of this, this would have been 12 Chernobyls. Because once that had caught fire, that pond had caught fire, it would be like a pile of hot sticks. Once the water had gone, it would go. Once that caught fire, nobody could access anywhere near the 6 nuclear reactors they had there. And all of them would have actually eventually failed.
So that conflagration was avoided. David, though, what collective effort could the rest of the world, if they pile in and help the Japanese, what can they usefully do now to speed up this process of recovery?
The first thing they should do is to discourage the Japanese government from reopening the existing 52 reactors which are closed down in immediate aftermath. Japan is a very earthquake-prone country. It's quite possible there could be another significant earthquake in the near future, and I think Japan can have its energy sources provided from other sources other than nuclear.
You'd advocate they shut down the entire nuclear generation programme?
Well, the entire nuclear generation programme, bar 2 reactors, is already shut down. I'm saying that the Japanese government would like to reopen it, as with some of the Japanese nuclear industry. They have what's at the moment called stranded assets. They have invested millions and millions and millions of pounds into the construction and operation of these plants, and they're earning no revenue at all for the last 6 years. So you can see why they want to do it, but I don't think that's a good idea. The other thing that the other experts in the rest of the world can do is to try to help them on the clean-up of the radioactivity that got off-site. We've heard about the leakage of water into the Pacific and why that might worry Americans on the west coast of the United States. But the radioactive contamination of the area around is very damaging. There was an evacuation of about 160,000 people. About half have gone back so far. The problem is that the agricultural land is contaminated. We had this build-up of the scraping of the topsoil, which is radioactively contaminated, and all of these plastic sacks, which are shown in the film. And the other problem is the psychological damage on the people who've been dislocated from the site. And there's been a number of studies been done into that. And some people even say that for some people, like very old people, it would have been better not to evacuate them because the dislocation to their lifestyle, their community networks and so on, was worse than the effects of them catching, being exposed to radioactivity and getting cancer.
Okay, number of issues there. Let's try and unpick some of them. On the engineering side, Mark, they did try this ice wall, didn't they? They spent billions of yen trying to create this barrier to contain contaminated water. It still leaks.
It still leaks. It's obviously, you know, it's a step in the right direction. They've got they're trying to isolate the base of the reactors to stop the groundwater, which literally flows off the ground into the sea right underneath the reactors. And these reactors are now leaking really high levels of radiation into that water. Now, that water then goes out into the sea and is relatively diluted. We know that, you know, the fish are getting contaminated. You know, that's in a sense of all.
Is that not a priority in your view?
It is, in many respects, it's a priority, but it's not the priority. I mean, in a way, we are very lucky that this radiation is going into the sea. Now, it's a vast amount, but the Pacific is a very large ocean, and it's diluting.
So what's higher up your list of what they should do next?
Well,
I mean, they're trying to get inside these reactors. We heard about the robots going in there to assess them. I mean, is there any more they can do there?
Well, they've got to try and develop a program for actually containing everything and sealing the reactors so the water they're putting in there to cool it. Because the moment they're putting, I think, 400 tons of water a day goes into each reactor.
That creates another problem, doesn't it?
Well, that comes out as contaminated.
Contaminated water.
And they recycle parts of it, you know, to recool it, and the rest of it goes into the tanks. They're now getting to the point where they are beginning to talk about wanting just to drop the tanks into the ocean, because they just can't keep building, these tanks to keep the place cool.
And David, can they not build, I mean, let me put it in simple layman's terms, is there not a possibility to construct some kind of structure, concrete or whatever it is, as big and as solid as it needs to be to bury this whole site for a generation or more, so everything is contained? That's
exactly what they've done twice now at Chernobyl. They did a temporary one in the immediate aftermath of the accident in 1986. Yep. And last year they completed the refurbishment with a giant cowshed over the top of it, costing, I don't know, millions and millions and millions.
And did that work, in your view? Is that a sensible engineering task to undertake?
They have the same problem in Chernobyl as they have in Japan, in that they are concerned about radioactivity getting into the water. In the case of Ukraine, it's into the river system, which feeds down into Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Yeah. So they don't want that to happen. So putting a big containment over the top stops radioactivity going into the air, but it doesn't necessarily stop radioactivity getting into the groundwater. In Japan, it's a different situation. They do want to stop it getting into the air, and if they're going to continue to keep cooling it down, they will get leakage into the runoff and into the ocean. The other thing that should be made stressed about this is that in that particular Fukushima design, they put the spent fuel storage pond, as was mentioned, it's high up off the ground. And they're very lucky that the earthquake didn't destroy the
containment vessels for that.
Yes, didn't destroy the support system for that. Because if that had crashed down completely, it'd be even worse. And they should be looking at all the other reactors. I'm sure there are more reactors with spent fuel storage ponds high up off the ground. And they also need to have off-site alternative operating systems. In the case of the Fukushima, they didn't have the system separated out from the main plant, so that they couldn't remotely operate the plant with people off-site, and it's a major design fault.
I think these have now all become part of the reason why the next generation of nuclear has become more expensive. I mean, Sizewell A was relatively similar to one of these power stations. It had a
that was built in the UK, wasn't it?
In the UK, yes. It was recently decommissioned, but its fuel pond was basically sitting in the open air. Well, I say open air. It had a single skin of metal over the top of it. Right. It was assumed that the water would stay in there, and fortunately it did, and it's now been emptied. And they've now built, for Sizewell B, they've built a very large what's it called? It's a spent fuel processing, well, containment area.
It's a dry storage.
Dry storage. And then they wouldn't be operating sizable B now if they hadn't been able to build that, because the fuel pond there was acknowledged after Fukushima as being far too full and very prone, if there was an accident, to catching fire.
Well, we'll continue our conversation about that worldwide impact in just a moment. You're watching Insight. We were once promised the atomic age would solve all our power problems. So what is the future for nuclear power? In a moment, we'll find out about the future of nuclear power. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. New Zealand's North Island is bracing itself as Cyclone Cook, called the worst storm in generation, hits inland. States of emergency have been declared in the northeast of the country, with landslips, flash flooding and downed power lines crossing roads. It comes after severe floods caused by the remnants of Cyclone Debbie hit some parts of the country last week. A Malaysian court has deferred the case of two women accused of killing the estranged half-brother of North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. Prosecutors have requested more time to collect documents and for the case to be transferred to a higher court. The case has been postponed until May 30th. And protests in Venezuela continue to grow following the killing of a teenage demonstrator. A 14-year-old boy and another protester were shot dead. The local governor has blamed armed government supporters. Nicolas Maduro's presidency has come under increasing pressure as the economy suffers, and opponents accuse him of creating a dictatorship. Back now to nuclear power and the impact of events like Fukushima. Before the crisis, 30% of Japan's power was nuclear. Afterwards, all 48 power stations were shut down. 6 years later, only 2 are back online. But while some countries have sworn off nuclear power because of public opposition, others are forging ahead with a new atomic age. There are currently 31 countries in the world which have operational nuclear power plants. The world's first nuclear power plant was built at Obninsk in Russia in 1954, and despite it being experimental technology, it operated until 2002 without any major incidents or deaths. The US has the largest number of nuclear reactors in the world, with 61 commercially operating nuclear power plants, with 99 nuclear reactors in 30 US states. In 2015, nuclear power plants in the US accounted for 19.5% of US electricity and generated 797.2 billion kilowatt hours. France is home to the second largest number of nuclear reactors in the world. It has 58 reactors scattered across 23 different locations. The country derives about 75% of its electricity from nuclear energy due to a long-standing policy based on energy security. In comparison, in Latin America, there are just 7 nuclear power reactors, 3 in Argentina, 2 in Brazil, and 2 in Mexico. Well, with me in our studio today, Mark Whitby is Chairman and Design Director at the engineering consultancy firm WME, and Dr. David Lowry, an independent research policy consultant who specialises in nuclear issues. We have this discrepancy, David, don't we? The Chinese are marching ahead, believing that nuclear really is the way forward. Europeans more sceptical. Germany is trying to go nuclear power free soon.
Yes, well, the Chinese are pushing ahead with a significant number of new nuclear power plants, but they're also pushing ahead with a large number of wind power machines and also solar energy. In fact, they're the world's biggest wind power manufacturers at the moment. China's going big in everything. In Europe, the reason why the nuclear power has been reined back is twofold. One is the post-Fukushima accident concerns, and that's why the German Chancellor in the immediate aftermath decided to bring forward the close down of the nuclear power program in Germany, which was already going to be phased out over a longer time period. In other countries, the problem has been finance. France does get a huge amount of its electricity from nuclear, but its main nuclear power generator, EDF, is 33 billion euros in debt. It can't find the money to build a new nuclear power plant at Hinkley C in the UK. And the constructor manufacturer, Areva, is at the moment embroiled in a number of controversies, including allegations that it doctored the data sheets on safety for the French nuclear safety regulator and could end up in big trouble with the nuclear safety regulator in France. In the United States, although the government speaks positively about new nuclear, those who want to invest in it say the opposite. The one company that's building nuclear plants in America, Westinghouse, has just filed for bankruptcy in the United States. Its owner, Toshiba, from Japan, is also in financial crisis and could actually collapse as a company. And the United States has only got one reactor complex under construction, and that's by Westinghouse, who may have none under construction in the near future.
Yeah. It's not a very happy picture, isn't it? Mark, is it this huge capital cost that we alluded to in our first conversation, that because you have to build in so many safety factors into a nuclear power station these days, they're almost too costly to build?
Well, it's not just that, it's also the fact they take forever to make. I mean, the one in France, Flamanville, which David mentioned, which where Areva have falsified the accounts or the safety records for the reactor head. That's been now put on hold. It's maybe 3 times over budget, and it's about 6 years late.
Yeah.
Now, that's costing people a lot of money. If you took the same money and invested it in a wind turbine, you'd have a return tomorrow, and you could then reinvest the money you earned from that again to get another return. England, well, Europe actually has the most fantastic resource in terms of the North Sea, which is a benign environment where the wind blows, and it's easy to build wind turbines. Germany, Holland, Denmark, and other countries have clubbed together to really exploit this, building an industry, whether it's Siemens or Vestas, around that, and are leading the way. There's even a plan to build a new island in the North Sea, just outside British territorial waters, which will act as a hub to transmit the power back to Europe.
And what would render nuclear generation as uneconomic if that works?
There is no question. Nuclear is uneconomic. We know that. It's already been demonstrated by the subsidy that EDF had to be granted in order to begin to even think about building Hinkley. And even as they begin to think about it, there's no private investor who will come forward and do it.
But David, what's the conundrum here? Normally, when an engineering process matures, wisdom grows in it, technique get better, and normally the cost comes down. But it seems as the decades have worn on, the cost of using nuclear power to generate electricity just seems to go off the scale.
Well, nuclear is unique in terms of industries. It has a negative learning curve. That the longer
Just
you
explain that.
Plant,
what do you mean?
The longer you operate a nuclear power plant, the more complex it becomes, the more problems that they have, and it turns out that they end up having more and more difficulties the older it gets. Rather than learning from the past, they actually have more difficulties.
Yeah.
And because nuclear is strictly regulated for good reasons, that if you have a problem in an accident like Fukushima or Chernobyl, you have a disaster, the regulators keep on requiring more and more upgraded standards for operating of the plant, which cost money for the operators. And of course, when they have to turn them off in order to implement changes, they're losing the revenue they would have got from selling the electricity. So it's what they call a stranded asset. It's a big, expensive engineering plant sitting there.
And they have a ridiculous long tail too, don't they? Because you've got costs to look after the waste products from this process for generations to come.
Well, it's quite interesting that, because the decommissioning of our existing fleet in England is costing more than the value of all the electricity that they generated in their lifetime. And that's just the decommissioning and trying to... We haven't even found a way...
If we were able to spin back, you'd just never have started, would you? If you knew that was going to be the end financial cost.
But you have to also bear in mind that when we set out to do this, there was an ulterior motive. With the first nuclear power stations were not purely domestic generators. They were, as we suspect in Iran, also about making nuclear material for weapons.
Absolutely, that's exactly what happened, and indeed some of the material that was produced in those reactors has ended up in the nuclear warhead stockpile both in UK and in the United States.
A pessimistic way in which to end our conversation, but Mark Whitby, David Lowry, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's end our programme, shall we, with the Insight Bite. This is a little something that we feel you should know. And today we are in China, where the nation has been welcoming in the new year. And for those in the southwest, that means dragon boat races, a 2,000-year-old tradition. Manoeuvring and racing a dragon boat demands good coordination and communication of a large team, all of whom need to paddle in time. Otherwise, the boat will start to feel tippy, rocking from one side to another. Fortunately for the 600 competitors in this year's race, it was all smooth sailing.